Good evening. Welcome to tonight's faculty panel. This panel is part of our year-long Education for Justice programming around the theme of finding justice after 9/11. My name is Mike Allison. I'm the coordinator this year of our Education for Justice program, and I'm also a professor in the political science department, as well as a member of the Latin American and Women's Studies department. Tonight, we're pleased to welcome 4 University of Scranton faculty drawn from the College of Arts and Sciences, the Kenya School of Management, as well as the Panushka School of Professional Studies. These faculty are going to speak about how 9/11 has affected their teaching, their research, as well as their fields of study. I'm going to just take a minute or two to introduce the 4 of them, and then we'll have each panelist give about a 12 to 15-minute talk just on, again, how 9/11, we always talk about how 9/11 changed everything. I don't think we've, thought at the university here a lot about how 9/11 has affected our teaching, right? And sort of the issues that we study, how we approach them, right? How we deal with students, and how they deal with us. And so I'd like to introduce first Professor Rebecca Haggerty. She's the Director of Assessment and Accreditation for the College of Arts and Sciences. She's also a part-time faculty member in the Philosophy Department and the Kenya School of Management's MBA online program. She's also Vice President of Marley's Mission. Right? We have Dr. Darryl DeMarzio. He's an Assistant Professor in the Education Department. He's also currently the President of the Mid-Atlantic States Philosophy of Education Society. And his area of scholarship is more in the ethical, spiritual, and aesthetic dimensions of teaching. Okay. We have Professor Bill Lambert as well. Right? Dr. Lambert, Professor Lambert's a faculty specialist in the Department of Occupational and Physical Therapy, and his research interests include child, adolescent, and adult mental health issues. He's practiced in inpatient settings, and he continues today to maintain a small private practice. And then finally, we'll have Professor Teresa Grettano speak. She teaches writing and rhetoric in the Department of English and Theater. Her research is focused more on rhetoric and the discourse of 9/11. She served on the steering committee for Rhetoricians for Peace, but many of you know her from her freshman seminar related to 9/11, as well as maybe some English some writing composition classes we have here, as well as directing this semester's Education for Justice film series. So thank you all for showing up. As I mentioned at the beginning, we're going to have about 12 to 15-minute presentation for each faculty member. And then at the end of it, we're going to open up to questions. So please think of some really good questions or comments, and hopefully we'll have some good responses. So thank you. Rebecca?
Thank you. Do I need to, can you all hear me? Yeah? Okay. Now let's see, did you take my paper notes? Just out of curiosity. Oh, thank you. When I was asked to do this, I thought about it, and what immediately came to mind in thinking about this is just the millennial generation and looking at our students and how that might have changed how we might teach students. We're all kind of familiar with these different generations. We have the traditionalists, the baby boomers, and Generation Xers, particularly as we are teachers, many of us in here. And I thought it was interesting to look at some of their mindsets and the traditionalists look at the chain of command. Baby boomers tend to be like, change the command, they want to change it. And Generation Xers are self-command. I'll tell myself, I'll decide what to do, what not to do, how to do it. But we have this new generation of students, and they're the millennials. Some people refer to them as the M factor, and they've had all kinds of different little nicknames, but I like M factor, I like millennial. Their defining word is realistic, and their mindset is don't command, collaborate. And I believe that a lot of this is from having grown up in 9/11, being part of 9/11. It says in here that their career goals are to build parallel careers, and what we see with millennials is that not only do they work a job maybe in the day, but they have other things on the side that are their job. They do web design on the side, so they do something from 9 to 5, but they are really involved in other things as well, so they have these parallel careers. And I think it's helpful that when you realize and recognize some of the generalizations with these students, it can help us to appreciate the impact that 9/11 had on them, and it can help us in our teaching and how we might be better engaging with them. And I will note that this is a generalization, doesn't apply to everybody, but as a generalization, it can be helpful, can be a tool. I have a quick quote, well, not too quick, but I thought this expressed well what generation, the millennial generation looks like. This is from Millennials Rising the Next Generation by William Strauss. It says, 10 is a formative age, not yet a teenager, no longer a little kid, becoming independent, but still deeply attached to family, aware of the world, but not yet cognizant of how it works. The events of 9/11 destroyed a sense of security for this cohort of children. Born as the Cold War ended, they grew up in a decade that saw massive economic growth, the dawning of the World Wide Web, and a culture riddled with cynicism. They tend to be sheltered, close to their parents, and confident. The attack brought terror to the doorsteps. 9/11 was the beginning of a new fear in America about chaos and uncontrolled disorder in the world. Children saw their teachers and parents worried and in some cases emotionally wrecked. They watched police officers and firefighters, community protectors dying in piles of rubble. They got caught up in a collective sense of national dread. What's next? They offer a unique glimpse into the mindset of a group of Americans coming of age under the shadow of terrorism. With that being said, it's interesting to then look at the millennial generation. There's basically 75 million of them right now, and a study was done in which they looked at these, this millennial generation, and they came up with 7 factors or trends that are associated with them. And when we look at each one of them, you really can see where they developed and how they developed with 9/11 in the backdrop. Parenting changed. These kids grew up in a very child-centric environment. We are focused on them. Parents started to learn they could control their kids and their development so they could become outstanding kids. This is where we got baby Einstein at birth. We've got people playing music while they're in the belly because we think we can control how outstanding they can be as students and as grown-ups when they get older. And so we've moved this paradigm shift from parent-child model to parent-protege model. We want our children to be a reflection of us. And also thinking in parenting, the millennial generation is different in terms of location. Many are in the suburbs. Their parents are chauffeuring them from place to place. I know when I grew up, I used to walk through the woods a very long distance, cutting through different streets to get to school. Today, that would not happen. Today, we would never dream of letting a child walk through the woods to school, never even knowing if they arrived to school or not until they came home from school. So it's very different. So the parenting for this generation is very different. This generation has a sense, a trend of entitlement. They grow up in the area of the time when everyone gets a trophy. And so that has an impact in how we teach and we reach them. One study by the Aspen Educational Group reported they did a study of 16,400 students on a narcissistic personality inventory between 1982 and 2006. In 1982, 30% of the students were above average. In 2006, 65% were above average. So they're definitely moving towards a focus on their self, which, no surprise, they're in this child-centric environment. You can see all of these are intertwined. This generation, one of their biggest trends is meaning. They want meaning. They want meaning in what they do. They're seeking it, and this is probably one of the greatest ways to integrate into the education of these students is they're looking for value. They're not just looking for a degree. They're not looking just to get out. They want to make a difference in life in this world. They're interested in these concerns because they've seen the world come to an end. 9/11, for many, seemed like an end. They have great expectations, meaning they have high expectations that the minute they will come into the classroom or the minute they will go to work, they're going to be completely fulfilled. They're going to have that value and that meaning. So as a teacher, again, one of the things that we can do is we can define what our expectations are of them, and we can help them to know how to succeed by giving them goals and giving them directions and the tools to succeed because they do want to succeed. They definitely are in a state of the need for speed. They're all on technology. They grew up on it. Play-by-play action of what happened on 9/11 was on the television. We have Twitter. We have IM. So they want this. And if part of this in teaching would be teaching literacy in terms of information. What information is valuable? What information is true and is good? Libraries can be very helpful in this because many times they think, well, it's on the internet, it's got to be true. No, it doesn't have to be true. So this can be integrated into the teaching in terms of library literacy, research literacy, determining what's valuable, what's not valuable. They have a strong social networking. Again, this access to instant information, everything. They have real communities as well as these virtual communities. And one of the things that I do in terms of the social networking when I teach, which I never would have done years ago, is, I am on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. They can follow me if they want to follow me, talk to me if they want to talk to me that way, but it's a way that I can communicate with them that they may want to communicate with. Not all of them want to, but some do. It's just a different avenue. And it reminds me a little bit of when, as we've developed our educational model to incorporate issues of disability. We all learn in different ways. We have to incorporate those ways. Some people are visual learners, some people are tactile learners. And this is just another element of learning how to reach out, touch the students, and be a part of the students is learning how do they relate, what is interesting to them. This generation is also built on collaboration and cooperation. They thrive on praise. They want praise, which is in teaching. That comes in the form of encouragement to engage them. The other part is they want to be heard. These kids, many of these millennial kids in a general form, have been part of the family discussion about what kind of car should we buy, where should we live, what kind of house. I'm always amazed to hear some of the students talk about these things, whereas, again, when I was younger, I never knew if we were moving or not until there was a moving truck. All of a sudden, these kids, they're deciding which one. My kids picked my car. So they're involved in this, and they've been empowered that way. And it's all helped this parenting relationship. Again, it's much more stronger. It's much more interdependent. I wanted to look a little bit at this issue of meaning because I see this frequently in the classroom. This is probably one of the biggest things that I like to bring into the classroom, that the students want value. They're looking for value in everything that they do. Kelly Global Workforce Index did a study. 51% of young workers were prepared to accept a lower wage or a lesser role if they contribute to something more important and meaningful. 9 out of 10 said meaning was most important to them in the job. They want to make a difference in the world. So when I teach ethics, because I teach ethics and business ethics and sustainability, I approach it from issues I think they might be interested in, issues that are close to them, issues that may not be that you automatically think of as being an issue. There was a time when we talked about a lot about euthanasia and about abortion, but today we're talking more about issues of, is water a human right? Can air be purchased by companies? Should they be able to own it? So I try to come at it from an avenue that they might be interested in, that it's a topic they may be interested in, that they're confident in, that they've had experiences with, but at the same time, areas that they want to make a difference. 90% of millennials said they having an opportunity to give back via their company when they finally get a job was somewhat important to them. And so I teach a lot about corporate social responsibility. Again, something quite new in the business language that's being talked about is corporate social responsibility and teaching about it. Another thing that this generation has as it relates to 9/11 is they have a global awareness, not just knowing the map and that there's different countries besides the United States, but they also have a global awareness about the issues of the environment and about sustainability, and they're interested in it. 88% of millennials feel the environment awareness is at least somewhat important when considering employment. And they are monitoring how well it is being done, which is interesting. They're monitoring it. It's important to them. They're looking at it. And 20% thought their employers were, only 20% thought their employers were doing a good job in this one study. They're looking for green amenities. They want to see green initiatives going on. They're looking for it in the classroom. They're looking to talk about it in the classroom. Millennials are interested in these subjects, so I find it very important as a teacher to engage them in it. And they are hands-on. Again, they want to see a difference. Clark College actually hosted a week where the faculty and the students didn't buy coffee and didn't buy bottled water, and then they donated the proceeds to a water conservatory company or organization. They want to see the difference. They want to be a part of it. We see in teaching from 9/11 this paradigm shift. One is the discovery method. They don't want to just be told what to do. They want to discover it. And so they want projects that, one, they're interested in, ones that they can participate in. They want engagement. And they want visionary leadership. And visionary leadership is, in this case, the teachers. They look up to us. They want to be a part of something. They want to follow us as a leader. But what is interesting is they don't want a vision that's my vision. They don't want a vision that's just their own vision. They want a vision that they're in it. Their hopes and dreams can come true, but they're with everybody else. They're very much a collective group. They like team, they like groups, and so they're looking for visionary leadership. So I see this as a way to be part of that with them, is we can be one of their first visionary leaders to carry them on the way, to either encourage them to be their own leaders, to encourage them to do things and to find value. Providing lots of challenges, but also providing the structure to back it up is important to them. They want to succeed again, but they want to do it on their own, but they need some direction on how to do this. It means breaking down goals into steps, as well as offering any necessary resources and information. Again, tying into this information access. They have instant information. Let's teach them which is the correct information, which is Wikipedia may not be completely accurate. Is there another source we can back it up with? And also, it's a way to teach them how to be mentors and coaches. When you're a visionary leader, you're teaching a student to be a mentor and to be a coach eventually. Another big thing, obviously, with 9/11 is the issue of violence. I found this and thought this was very appropriate. It's a father talking to his son. When I was your age, I had to walk 6 miles through snow to get to school. And the little kid says, wow, you had it easy, because on the newspaper it says school shooting, bomb threat. So this is what the millennial generation has grown up with. Safe space is important to them. Fears of violence and crime increased. This parent-child interdependence. That's why one of the first things we see is this paradigm shift in the relationship between the parent. That's why parents are carpooling and taking their kids to their events. There's no more play dates where you just run outside and play on the playground. There's structured play dates where I'll drop my child off at your house for 2 hours. Then I'll come back and I'm going to leave you with a list of all the allergies my child has. This is new. This is something that has developed, a lot of it from fear. Millennials have been directly affected by personal threats stemming from violent outbreaks. 9/11, Columbine, Virginia Tech, the proliferation of gangs, readily available illegal drugs. These kids grew up with the Amber Alert. There's always a threat that you might be taken. And so all of this has had an impact on what they are, where they're coming from, and it helps us understand them. So we have a game change in how we teach these kids. Personal safety is the millennials' #1 concern, particularly for those entering the workplace. I've read a couple of articles where managers have been thrown off guard because candidates for employment ask them, well, what do you do if there's a bomb in the store? Do you have a practice for this? These are new things for us to consider. And I know many kids even think that now, even in the classroom. You know, is there a safe way out of my classroom? How am I going to exit this classroom and get out should something happen? So what does this mean for decision making? If you can understand the millennial generational generalizations and embrace some of them, what you get from this is when these students, and this comes out in teaching, when they make decisions a little differently than they were made in the past. They're collaborative. They want to talk to everybody. They want to still know what their parents think. They want to talk to their friends and see what their friends think. They want to tweet about it. They want to Facebook about it. So whereas that was not the case years ago. They're interested in social issues. They will seek social media for information and to spread causes. Look at all the different crises that have taken place, and it's been on YouTube, it's been on cell phones, it's been spread through to create other people to collaborate with them. Ethical decision tools, looking for more broader theories. We certainly have in philosophy the basic theories, but some of the other things that can be integrated into teaching students so that they can embrace the background they're coming from, is talking about human rights, talking about a common sense theory that we should consider the least, and that we should consider others in some way. And the issues have changed, as I mentioned. We used to be euthanasia, abortion, all very important topics. But now, again, we're talking about water. Is water a human right? Can business own the air? Is it okay to, for some countries to practice child bride marriage? What about child labor laws? And so so really my main part of this was about theory, that we can look at the generalizations of this generation and garner some information that might be extra tools that can help us to teach. I have found them helpful in the classroom, approaching different things. I teach business ethics, and when I first started teaching it, I was told that the students wouldn't talk a lot. I find they talk a lot, but I bring up a lot of subjects that I think they're more interested in, because they're interested in talking about the ethics of social media. They're interested in talking about, should the media talk about suicide and how a person has committed suicide, or is that a private matter that shouldn't be out there? Is that irresponsible? They want to talk about the things that touch them and touch their lives, and they want to be a part of it. They want to be valuable to society. They want to make a change, and they want to make a difference. And I believe it's because 9/11 has shaped them in many ways. They've seen, for what most of them, they were 7, 8, 9, 10. Their life almost came to an end. They didn't know what was happening. And so they want to make a difference. The one other, that was more of my theory, and then I just have a short thing which is on the application of it. And what I have found with 9/11 is it really has opened up this conversation about how do you have business ethics and business practices after a major crisis? Can you have a profit? I had one student whose father was a police officer at 9/11, and he said he was sickened that somebody was selling T-shirts with the Twin Towers on it right after 9/11. It bothered him. And so this opens up this conversation of how do you have an ethical business and how do you do ethical practices after a crisis, after that aftermath? Can you make a profit? Should you help people? What's altruism about? So I have this little clip, which now I'm not sure. I'm going to need help. And it's very short, but it's a trader who's on in New York talking about what his first reaction was when 9/11 happened. And I talk about this in the class, and we try to figure out from here is what do we do with crises.
Okay, so you can press play whenever you want.
What's the play button? Oh, right there.
Right there.
All right. How do we turn the sound up?
I've got to be honest with you. When the September 11th situation happened,
Okay, so then.
Is that loud
I
enough?
didn't know that. And I must say, I want to say this because I want to take it lightly. It's not a light situation. A devastating act. It was really a bad thing. It was the worst things I've seen in my lifetime, you know. But I will tell you, and every trader will tell you, who was not in that building, and who was buying gold and who owned gold and silver, that when it happened, the first thing you thought about was, well, how much is gold up? The first thing that came to mind was, my God, gold must be exploding. Fortunately for us, all of our clients were in gold. So when it went up, they all doubled their money. Everybody doubled their money. It was a blessing in disguise. Devastating, crushing, heart-shattering, but on a financial sense. For my clients that were in the market, they all made money. Now, I wasn't looking for this type of help. But it happened. When the U.S. bombed Iraq back in 1991, the price of oil went from $13 to $40 a barrel, for Christ's sake. Now, we couldn't wait for the bombs to start raining down on Saddam Hussein. We were all excited. We wanted Saddam to really create problems. Do whatever you have to do. Set fire to some more oil wells because the price is going to go higher. Every broker was chanting that. There was not a broker that I know of that wasn't excited about that. This was a disaster. This was something that was, you know, catastrophe happening, bombing, wars. In devastation, there is opportunity.
Ah, that one's hard. Yeah.
But there was a time.
I don't know what to do. So we bring this up in class and we start to talk about that. Is there an ethics of in devastation there is opportunity? And what is that opportunity? Is that opportunity more gold, more money, profit? How do businesses operate with that? And how do we think about that? So it kind of had a theory on the generalizations of the millennial generation, and then an application. So thank you for listening to me, and thank you for having me. You got it from here?
We're good.
It's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Rebecca. Next up, we're going to have Dr. DeMarzio. He's going to talk a little bit more about the emergence of a new notion of educational justice, the notion of formative justice. I don't know which one's yours.
Thank you. I just have a prepared paper, essentially. And I thank everyone for attending, and thank you for the invitation. When I first read the call for participating in this panel on finding justice after 9/11, I immediately thought that I might not have anything of potential value to contribute. Specifically, when it came to reflecting on the connections between the post-9/11 universe and the courses that I teach, the research that I undertake, or my particular field of study, a field often identified as the philosophy of education, I could not immediately draw any strong bonds. However, the more I reflected, the more I became intrigued by this year's theme of finding justice after 9/11, and in particular, the entire notion of education for justice, and what that might mean today, and what sort of conceptual connections exist between the notions education and justice. I then turned to some of the more recent trends in the field of philosophy of education, specifically trends that might be located and gaining in momentum following the event of 9/11. And I posed the following question. In what ways has the relationship between education and justice been recast since 9/11, specifically when it comes to the philosophical analysis of both terms, education and justice? So I will suggest here that there is a trend underway, though hardly significant at this early juncture, which has begun to rethink what educational justice means and what sort of critical emphasis we should place upon the idea of education for justice. I will suggest that the long-standing emphasis on distributive justice in education, or the problem of how educational goods and resources ought to be distributed, is giving way to a notion of formative justice in education, in which the primary concern is the problem of what human potentials we should devote our attention to, given that we have a plentiful supply of such potentials, but a limited amount of time, energy, and resources to commit to them. Before I get to that suggestion, however, I would like to begin by describing what September 11, 2001 has meant to me in terms of the path that I have taken as a scholar, philosopher, and educator, specifically an educator of teachers. From this beginning personal narrative, I hope to follow a thread that runs right up to the idea of formative justice that I would like to talk about with you this evening. It was to be that week of September 2001 that I began my doctoral studies in the program in philosophy and education at Columbia University in New York. At the same time, I was also teaching foundational courses in philosophy of education to pre-service and in-service teachers at Montclair State University in New Jersey. Normally in these courses, I always on the first day of class throw out that typical icebreaker sort of question. In this case, why do you want to become a teacher? It took only a few semesters for me to realize that the answers my students offered could easily fall into just a few basic categories. First, there were the answers that revealed a very deep service ethos, and Rebecca, I think, touched upon this. such as I want to help children be the best they could be, I want to make a difference in society, and so on. This first category usually contained the majority of my students' responses. And again, these students are undergraduates, usually emerging right out of high school, so around 18, 19 years old. The next category was certainly the smallest one, but I should still mention it. And it's a distinctive category in that the responses here were striking in their overall apathy about the teaching profession and education. And here students would say, in responding to the question, why do you want to become a teacher, they would say, well, summer's off, or I was good at school and it's a job. But then there was a third category that revealed a deep ethos, but not one strictly rooted in the desire to be of service to others, but rather an ethos that put the living of one's own life and the quality of that life at the center. These soon-to-be teachers responded to the question of why teach by saying things like, I was going through life not thinking about what is really important, and so I decided that I needed to change my life. So I decided to become a teacher. Now, there are a few reasons that I raised this experience. The first is that several of these students in this latter category happened to have turned to teaching shortly after 9/11. They were adults in their 40s and 50s, making a radical career and life choice and life change. Some had worked either in or near the towers, pursuing careers in finance and making a good deal of money at it. Others had lost friends, family, or colleagues in the attacks, and they had recalibrated their lives and turned toward the profession of teaching to do so. The more I met these kinds of student teachers, the more I became deeply interested in the question of what is it about the practice of teaching that attracts people seeking this kind of deep meaning. Why is teaching a response to the question, how should I live, or what should I become? Furthermore, how, if so at all, does the practice of teaching actually contribute to the flourishing of the person who teaches? These questions eventually became the source for my dissertation and much of my scholarly endeavors since. So now, excuse me, I would like to tie these personal reflections to the issue of education, education and justice and their relationship. You'll notice that the category of responses that I have highlighted here, can I log out? Yeah. Okay. You'll notice that the category of responses that I highlighted, those responses that have to do with entering a profession, in this case teaching, as an answer to the question, how should I live? These are responses that view one's education as a process of substantive formation. In other words, they implicitly view education as a formative endeavor. But this really isn't saying much. After all, to consider education as a formative endeavor is a very common, almost universal consideration. However, the tendency, especially when it comes to educational policy debates or debates about standards and core curriculum, is not to consider education as formation, but instead to consider education as a resource among resources, much like any material good whose public demand often exceeds our collective ability to supply it. As Robbie McClintock, the leading educational theorist writing on this notion of formative justice today, says, in this view, and that is in this view of education as a kind of material good or public resource, education collapses into schooling. So much seat time devoted to this or that, with the only issue of justice being one of access to formal opportunities, which get counted up among the cornucopia of public goods. Who will get so much of what kind? End quote. As I alluded to earlier, the set of concerns addressed in this quote belong to that long-standing concern over distributive justice in education. How do we distribute education in such a way that accords with justice? Now, these concerns are obviously legitimate and appropriate. It is vital that a society concerned with the education of its people contend with questions such as who or what should be the arbiter of educational opportunity? How much access to educational opportunity depends upon standardized testing? Who designs these tests? Are they fair? How should they be used? And so on. Teacher educators such as myself are very close to these kinds of provocative questions, specifically questions about the function of standardized assessments. The main problem that many of us see is that mass standardized testing is becoming the main arbiter of educational opportunity. This is one of the reasons why we refer to them as high-stakes tests. But the real issue at hand with regards to high-stakes testing and educational justice is that we are also beginning to lose sight of assessment as serving a formative and not merely a distributive function. In other words, we need to return to the idea that assessment can be used as a diagnostic tool, a way of helping people realize and achieve a potential or set of potentials. That is to say, they can be in the service of human formation. It is no surprise then that in the lexicon of education, such diagnostic tests are usually referred to as formative assessments. We can stick with the example of testing in order to highlight the goal of distributive justice. How does testing and assessing students help us realize fairness and equality, the goals of distributive justice in education? A standardized test, such as the SAT or the GRE, so long as every eligible person has an equal opportunity to take it, will help us decide in a fair way how to distribute educational resources and goods. If you achieve a certain range of score, you can have access to the limited supply of educational resources. And the procedure for distributing those resources, testing in this case, are fair, assuming that the system for distribution is based on merit and achievement. But the goal of formative justice is not the equality and fairness of the system for distributing educational resources, mainly because education is not viewed as this type of external materiality, but is viewed primarily as an internal, sometimes spiritual striving. The goal of formative justice, according to Robbie McClintock, is human fulfillment. And as such, human fulfillment should also be the goal of educational policy. The just educational policy is the one that aims at the fulfillment of human potential. McClintock writes, quote, "With respect to formative justice, the legitimacy of a regimen, whether that be the regimen of a teacher or a polity, turns on judgments of whether or not it rightly brings potentials to full realization, whether or not it respects and nurtures the conditions of human fulfillment. Advocates of formative justice will continue to be hard-pressed to answer the question of what counts as human fulfillment and who gets to decide what view of human fulfillment gets serious attention from an educational regimen. But if such questions come back to the fore of educational policy debates, we will have come a very long way indeed. Now we tend to only focus on methods for the most efficient distribution of educational resources. But there was a time that educators were known for providing reasons for learning. So my hope is that we can, in a sense, gain a kind of momentum. I think, Rebecca, you talked about this desire for meaning. I think if 9/11 has generated something, it might be this desire to connect one's education with this realization of full human potential. So thank you.
Thank you, Darryl. Next up, we have Bill Lambert. He's going to talk a little bit about a research program that he's carried out with several graduate students here at the university on how the trauma of 9/11 affected at least one person in particular in the days, months, and years following the events of that tragic day. So, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming, and good evening. Before we begin, I guess I should ask, has anybody here, or was anybody here at Ground Zero or at the Pentagon? Can you tell what that was like? And where you were? Excuse me?
During the attacks or after?
During.
Oh, no.
On the day of 9/11.
No.
Where were you? So the question I'm asking is, where were you on 9/11 when the terrorist attacks occurred? Think back in your mind where you were. What were you seeing? I'm imagining that you were watching things on television. I know where I was. I know what I was doing. I know what that day was like. Like most people, I have continued my life and moved on in lots of ways. Occasionally, I'll look at a blue sky and I'll think, against my will pretty much, about a plane hitting a tower. Now, otherwise, I don't think that I think on a daily basis too much or a regular basis about the events of 9/11. But imagine if you were an individual who happened to be at Ground Zero when the plane struck the tower. And I'm going to tell you about some research that I and some students from the University of Scranton conducted in 2010 that is all about what occupational performance, and I'm an occupational therapist, and we use all kinds of different language. And for us, occupation is all those things that you do each day that give your life meaning and importance. I had a student once when I was still practicing in the field who described occupational therapy as all those things you do from the moment you get up in the morning until you go to bed at night. So those are the things that OTs are focused upon. So we were wondering, how did 9/11 affect somebody at Ground Zero in terms of their daily functioning? What kind of impact did it have? And what's more is, as occupational therapists, healthcare providers, what are we doing or what could we do for such an individual? So today we're going to look at the changes in occupational performance, or how we do our daily activities, for a survivor of the 9/11 terrorist attack at Ground Zero who developed post-traumatic stress disorder, commonly known as PTSD. Okay, let me tell you a little bit about Fred. Fred was the subject of our study. At the time, Fred was 51 years old, and as I said, he had PTSD as a result of witnessing the attacks at Ground Zero. He was coming up out of the subway, had gotten off a PATH train, and when he got to the top of the stairs, his experience was pandemonium. At that time, I would like to point out, he had a very rewarding career. He had been employed for more than 8 years in the telecommunications field. And as he was leaving his train station on a regular, ordinary day, and he exited, this is what he saw. This is what he described to us. He saw body parts falling from the sky and men falling with their ties flying above them. He smelled plane fuel. The heat from the flames burned his face. His eyes and ears were clogged with all of the particulate matter that was in the air. You all remember seeing things on television, people running with clouds of dust all around them and behind them. That was Fred's experience. As he ran, he saw a flaming wheel running down the street, and he said, you know, I'm probably not going to make it. This is Fred's experience, and there's much more than I can tell in the few minutes that I have with you about what all of those things were that he experienced at Ground Zero at that particular time. Now let's look a little bit about what is post-traumatic stress disorder. PTSD is an anxiety disorder that is based on witnessing a trauma in which a person perceives a threat to themselves or to someone dear to them, and it results in the response of fear, helplessness, and horror. Naturally, that would be exactly what you would think Fred would experience at the time. Those that have PTSD may continue to feel fear, helplessness, or horror even after the experience is over and the danger has long passed. Symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder include re-experiencing the traumatic event through nightmares, flashbacks, and distressful reminders. Of interest to OTs, of course, is it causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, and other areas of functioning. And typical events other than 9/11 that can trigger PTSD in an individual include accidents, military combat, violent personal assaults, natural disasters, and human-caused disasters. This is Fred's experience of post-traumatic stress disorder as a result of his experiences at 9/11. And as we talked about in the definition of PTSD before, these things just keep coming. They experience these events long after the event is over, and there's very little control sometimes over that experience. So for Fred, he has the feeling of acting or feeling if the traumatic event was still occurring, intense psychological distress at exposure to internal or external cues that symbolize or resemble an aspect of the traumatic event. There's efforts to avoid activities, places, or people that arouse recollections of the trauma, markedly diminished interest or participation in significant activities, a sense of a foreshortened future, an exaggerated startle response, and according to the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Text Revision, which is the Bible of psychological diagnosing by the APA, the duration of the disturbance has to last for more than 1 month. Okay, we were looking, of course, at where occupational therapy does or doesn't fit in with 9/11 and PTSD. And we found that most of the literature addressed our involvement with PTSD in those traditional or common historic ways that people develop the disorder. Our literature review produced really no available research regarding what OTs were doing with 9/11 survivors who have PTSD. I might add, as a mental health clinician, part of the trouble with doing research in this area is the confidentiality that surrounds mental health treatment. We have HIPAA that protects our health information. We also have a lot of confidentiality, naturally, regards to people's mental health histories and treatment. In our attempts since then with research groups to find other people to follow up with, we've contacted research groups in New York City, contacted a psychologist that was there. Did any of the members want to contribute to a study? And the answer was no, which, of course, there could be very many reasons why someone who is a support group for PTSD might not want to contribute to a study. So OTs, as I was saying before, it's a health profession that works with people with physical and mental disorders. We focus on improving life skills and independence in daily life tasks. And we want people to participate in all those meaningful activities that they do each day. Part of the realm of occupational therapy is looking at mental illness and cognitive impairments as a focus of therapy. We used a qualitative single case study, which I won't go over all the nuts and bolts of this, because we really don't have the time, but one of the things that's particularly interesting about the instrument that we chose, it's the Occupational Performance History Interview 2. And the reason we chose this particular assessment tool is it uses a line of demarcation between past and present, and in looking at and structuring an interview with an individual. So that event might be a stroke, it might be a death in the family, what was life before, what was life like after. So we thought this was a perfect tool for looking at Fred and his life, because what was life like before 9/11? What was life like after 9/11? Themes emerged from our research regarding Fred's occupational functioning and performance. And whenever we talk about occupational, again, we're talking about all those things that occupy our time in the various areas of our lives. We looked at identity, competence, and settings environment. Those are the areas that the OPHI-2 breaks down themes for us. All right, some highlights about how all of this experience of being at ground zero and also having post-traumatic stress disorder affected this individual, Fred. He overestimates his own abilities, and it leads him to inappropriate occupations. I need to tell you that ever since he was at 9/11, at ground zero, Fred consequently lost his job that he had in telecommunications. And when we talked about some of those symptoms of PTSD that people can have, part of Fred's story was he had been relocated across the river to New Jersey in an office building, and he approached work one day. There was a lot of people in the parking lot. Thought, what's going on here? A car backfired, and Fred took off down the street, hid under a car, and he stayed there until someone came and got him, basically. He was also, when we talk about those things that are triggers or things that people seek to avoid, his office was looking across the river at Manhattan at a skyline that no longer had the Twin Towers. Also, of course, a big cue, a big trigger for an individual like Fred. So Fred really had a lot of problems with his employer, and his employer did not see things the way Fred did. Quotes from Fred: "I felt that it was not a performance issue, which is what they said they were trying to make it into." And when we talk about justice, we can think about how do we handle an employee in a situation where you want him to be working and at any given day at work something happens and he's hiding under a car. What are the implications for that individual? What is just about that? He said, "I felt like I was kicking butt in this job, in this industry, and unfortunately for some of these big companies, the bottom line is the almighty dollar, so I got let go." That's his way of perceiving the situation. Interestingly, he also, in terms of the situation, says, "My wife tells me I'm still playing the victim. If I am playing the victim role, I don't realize it." Just an aside about things that I've read about PTSD and other sorts of mental illness, which is very much an invisible illness compared to a physical illness that you might have, like MS or a stroke or whatever, is that people can't see the trauma that you're experiencing, and they expect you to snap out of it. Like, why are you still doing this? This is especially true of PTSD. So he may be playing the victim, but again, his family may not understand what he's going through. This is a very common thing. He had difficulty thinking about goals and personal projects for the future as a result of this illness. This is a good quote that indicates his sense of a foreshortened future. He says, "I don't think I have a whole heck of a lot of time left. When I say that, I mean that it sounds awful and everything. I don't know whether I'm actually talking about the next couple of months, but I'm thinking I only have maybe a few years left. Or sometimes I just think that something terrible is going to happen to me that's totally out of my control." We also looked at his past. As I said, this assessment looks at the past and also at the present. He did have a history of satisfying and meaningful experiences. He said it was not hard for him to stay motivated like it was now. He was the family breadwinner. He made a lot of money in Manhattan. He related most of his past identity to his worker role. He talked about family a little bit, being important, but everything kept coming back to this worker role, which of course he lost as a result of his experience. In terms of his identity, some of the problems that Fred is having is that he's not aware and he doesn't appraise realistically his limitations and strengths. He doesn't recognize that he plays the victim, if that is true, and he does not recognize that he doesn't perform well in jobs. One of the things that happened, and I do believe it's a part of his having PTSD, is he went from being in the telecommunications field to selling cars, and not being anywhere near Manhattan. He lived in a rural area outside of the city. He then, at the time of the interview that we based our research upon, he was doing real estate sales. Now, you really feel bad for this guy. This is a classic, is life not fair or what? He started selling real estate. We did our study in 2010, right after the crash. So, I mean, it's really a very sad thing. But he really didn't understand how he was not doing a good job with this. And I think he made some reasonable points that maybe he was. But nonetheless, his job history after the events of 9/11, clearly he could not hold a job, and he was not performing at jobs that he was skilled at. And perhaps because of this particular illness and the experiences that he had, one of the things that he could not go back to was telecommunications, because maybe that's a trigger. Maybe that's a huge reminder of the events of 9/11 because he was so invested in his job. He's not appraising how PTSD is still affecting his life. He did experience some positive change, so that not everything turned out poorly for Fred. He tried for more balanced roles. He had talked about what a long commute it was to get to Manhattan, 2 or 3 hours a day one way, because that allowed him to raise his children in a safe rural area. So now he could spend more time with his kids. He was doing more leisure things. He became a lot more active in his church. He really enjoyed those things that he was able to do now. Keeps coming back to, I'm not the primary breadwinner, a very important role, especially for men a lot of times, historically, because things have changed quite a bit, as was pointed out earlier, in terms of people's traditional roles and what they want out of life. That really bothered him. And again, there's a lot of feeling out of control, and then who wouldn't? No matter how much harder I work or what else I do, it is out of my control. Feeling loss of control was something he brought up about many circumstances. In terms of his competence, his lifestyle now lacks a clear sense of direction and meaning. His current job, which was the one I told you about selling real estate, he said, obviously it was not by choice. It's kind of evolved after basically being laid off after 9/11. His lifestyle is stressful for him with too many demands and priorities, and I also think this quote that I'm about to read really exemplifies the tension and anxiety that Fred feels. I don't think I ever totally de-stress, but who does, right? I'm always stressed. I'm that swan you see on the lake that looks so beautiful and graceful, but underneath the water, the feet are going 1,000 miles an hour. I thought that was such a really telling statement. In terms of competence, Fred's excessive personal expectations and what he wants out of life and his significant limitations in his diminished capacity creates this ongoing gap between accomplishments and standards, which results in a lot of self-doubt for Fred. Before 9/11, he said, I was performing normally. Post 9/11, when he lost his job that he had in Manhattan, he said, so they gave me this terrible review, said that I didn't care about my job, that I didn't help anybody out, that I didn't do anything unless I was told to. That was a crushing blow because I had 8-9 years of stellar reviews. As I said, I have just finished my best year. I still, to this day, I feel I was working well enough to continue to work, but maybe they were seeing something different. Probably running down the street and hiding under cars. And who knows? It probably did affect his work performance. I couldn't see how it could not help but do that. That's what they put in their review, but I don't agree with that. His competence in the past, he felt like a competent individual. Lifestyle was generally enjoyable, and he met most of his life goals. He said, and life was simpler for him then also. In my career in telecommunications, all I had to do was work hard and do the best job I could, and then that would be noted, and I'd be rewarded. In terms of his home life and social group, the emotional practical climate contributed really to his maladaptive functioning and coping. He said, 9/11 took a tremendous toll and stress on my marriage. Remember again that the wife believes that he's playing the victim in this situation. And again, he brings up, my wife is basically saying, unless you can stop playing the victim role, you're going to be mired and whatever for a while. From his point of view, and maybe it's true, he's not getting a lot of sympathy about having this disorder at the moment. Okay, we hypothesized a continuum of OT care for Fred that could be offered to people that have PTSD in situations like Fred's, people that are survivors of 9/11. Things we could have done for Fred, if he was our patient, would be based possibly on, in the acute phase, right after an event happens, on cognitive behavioral therapy. We'd look at symptom education and management. We'd help him identify triggers, and we would teach him some coping skills. In the chronic phase, which Fred is definitely in because this is 8 or 9 years post 9/11, we would help him return to his worker role. We would provide insight into job skills, performance values. We'd help him realistically assess his job skills. Maybe we suggest job training and selection, career counseling. Maybe we would develop better communication interaction skills. Being a clinician and a researcher and a professor, I certainly wasn't, and I'm still not, in a position to have carried out any of those things, which is kind of the sad thing about conducting this kind of research, because ethically there's really not anything that I could do. There's lots of things I would have wanted to say that would probably have tainted the research. Just, have you thought about counseling with your wife? What's going on here? I think we did look and say, have you looked into telecommunications again? And he just would shut down and not talk about that at all. Okay, what are the justice implications possibly from this experience? For me as a clinician, as an educator, one of the things I think is important is that we have to increase public awareness about PTSD. It's increasingly prevalent. It results from events like 9/11, but we're going to see a whole lot more of this, and we are seeing a whole lot of this, and occupational therapy is very involved in working with the returning vets from Iraq and Afghanistan, a war which, like no other, has many, many survivors that witnessed many horrible things. We have to decrease the stigma of having a mental illness and seeking mental health services. I believe we have to increase the availability and access to appropriate services, including occupational therapy. And certainly, since our lit review produced nothing about what OTs were doing with survivors from 9/11 for many different reasons. Having been a clinician for a couple decades, it's not always a priority. It's not always something you have time to do. It's something I have time to do now. But I think we need to get the message out there about the kind of things we can offer people that would help them with their problems. So by presenting and publishing relevant research that provides support for and an evidence base for practice with this population, I think would be important. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thanks, Bill.
By accident. You're welcome.
All right, next up, we have Teresa Grettano from the Department of English and Theater. Professor Grettano's going to talk a little bit about how her discipline's been more affected by 9/11, right, through her research on rhetoric and the discourse of 9/11. So, thank you.
I'm going to have to time myself. And I want to see if I stand next to the podium, if you could still hear me. Does it pick up? No? Okay. I'll stand on my tippy toes then. Let me cue this up the right way, and then we can get started. Rhetoric and composition is my discipline, and it looks at language from two different angles. One, the production of language or meaning, mostly in writing, right? How we produce texts to make meaning. It also looks at it through the consumption of texts, right? How our engagement with texts that other people have created make meaning. And what I wanted to do tonight, to take this forum as an opportunity to talk to you about rhetoric more so than composition. I'm assuming, and a lot of people in here are my students, and you've done this before, so I might skip through the beginning a little bit. But to think about rhetoric, because I figured that most of the students in here didn't have much experience with it, or at least as much experience as you did in terms of composition, okay? I wanted to start with what rhetoric is, and I'm assuming that a lot of you in the room have an understanding of rhetoric as being empty language. In our culture at large, rhetoric generally gets a bad reputation. It's generally associated with political speech, which is what I study a lot of, but for negative reasons. It's associated with people basically saying a whole bunch of stuff that doesn't mean anything, and usually to avoid real talk or serious talk about issues. That is not what the academic study of rhetoric is about, though we do look at that kind of language at times. The art of persuasion is another way that the academic study of rhetoric is generally understood, that we look at how it's best to convince people of things, how to make the best arguments, how to debate the best way. And that is still part of the academic study of rhetoric and what rhetoricians do. But this last part, the study of how meaning is made through language, texts, and discourse is really what the academic study of rhetoric has become. We look at how we understand the world around us through language, through texts, and through the information that we get on a daily basis. For the discourse of 9/11, the field, and only parts of the field, people in rhetoric study a whole range of different topics. Some of us are studying 9/11, the discourse that has come out of 9/11, the discourse of terrorism in general, taking a historical view of it, the discourse in the aftermath of 9/11, discourse of war possibly, international relations, things like that. So part of the field is looking at how meaning about 9/11 and its aftermath has been made through the language that we've used to talk about 9/11, how we've come to understand the events of 9/11 and its aftermath, and how this understanding has affected the way that we live, basically. It affected our reality, both materially and ideologically. And what this means is basically the ways that we act and the ways that we think or feel. And I wanted to make this now part of the audience participation part of the evening, and have you basically practice what rhetoricians do so that you can see what people in my field, or experience what people in my field do when we work with language to understand how meaning has been made for us after 9/11 or with us. And again, my students have done this in class and done this first example, so we're going to try to get through it a little quicker than I had planned and go to the second example. But through rhetorical analysis, rhetoricians understand that a writer makes a rhetorical choice when deciding which words to use in a sentence. The words that you choose to explain something make a difference in the way that that something is going to be understood, okay? This sentence scrolled under CNN headline news about a week after 9/11. I'm a news junkie. I was in Mobile, Alabama. My family, in case you can't figure that out already, was in New York. I was glued to the television. And this sentence scrolled under CNN headline news about a week after. Taliban vows revenge if U.S. retaliates. And it caught my attention. Now, this is before I studied rhetoric at the master's or at the higher education level. I had not really studied rhetoric at all. At this point, I was deciding on whether or not I was going to go for a PhD in rhetoric at this time. So I wasn't really trained well, but I knew the sentence meant something. And I worked through trying to find out what that meaning was. Now, if you think about this, think about the meaning and purpose of this sentence. Taliban vows revenge if U.S. retaliates. I'm going to ask, and there's not many of you in here who haven't done this in class before, but just in general, what does this mean to you? If you saw this scroll underneath the television screen on a news station, Taliban vows revenge if U.S. retaliates, what message do you think CNN is trying to send to its viewers? What would you think this meant? And you can talk now. What does the sentence mean to you? Taliban vows revenge if U.S. retaliates. What information are you getting out of it? Rebecca?
I don't know if this is right, but that the Taliban is wrong to begin with because it's U.S. retaliates. Retaliate if somebody's already done, if someone has done something to you.
Okay, we're going to talk about that word retaliate and revenge, but just in general, what were you going to say? What information are you getting out of this?
I feel threatened by it.
Okay, why do you feel threatened?
Vows to revenge, as if they would, be violent in some way towards the United States today.
Okay, and again, we're going to talk about how that gets projected through this one sentence. What was CNN trying to tell you? Or trying to tell its viewers when it put this message out? Taliban vows revenge if U.S. retaliates. It's supposed to be giving you the news, right? It's informing you of information. Basically, what CNN is trying to tell you through this sentence is that the Taliban is going to do something if we do something, right? And that something is something that's pretty scary on both ends, basically, is the information that you get out of this sentence. As a rhetorician, I would look at the construction of the sentence, try to figure out the parts of speech and what each one of them is doing. So if you think about the actors or the agents or the subjects, who's doing the acting in this sentence? Who are the players in the information? We've got the Taliban and the U.S., right? They're both the actors in the sentence. Then I would think about action. Okay, what's the Taliban doing? What's the verb? And then what's the U.S. doing? And what's the verb? And if we look at this, what's the Taliban doing? What's the verb attached to the Taliban? What's the verb? Okay, vows. Vows the verb. And what's the U.S. verb? Retaliates. Okay. Now think about the effects that these two word choices have on how we perceive the message that's being sent. Okay, the Taliban is going to do something bad if the U.S. does something bad, right? Bad, scary, okay? Vows and retaliates. Which would you rather have done to you? Would you rather have somebody vow toward you, or would you rather have somebody retaliate against you? Vow? Why? Okay, you think of marriage vows. You hear vow, and things come with that word, right? Vow is associated generally with pretty positive things. You think of marriage vows, right? It's got a religious connotation to it. It's got a commitment connotation to it. Retaliates, what is that attached to? What kind of baggage does that word come with? What does retaliate make you think of? Violence? Okay, why? If vows is kind of like a religious word, what kind of word is retaliate? It's a military kind of word. All right, so you would rather have somebody vow against you because generally vow means to say something than to actually retaliate, which thinks of like actual physical force. So right away, just because of those two verbs, we're making assumptions about the players in the sentence. Okay, the Taliban vows, the U.S. retaliates. But the action itself, the real action, isn't really in vows, right? That's not where the scary part of what's going on is. It's in the word revenge. Revenge and retaliate kind of do the same thing in this sentence. They send the same kind of message, right? They are both, the Taliban is going to bomb if the U.S. bombs. The Taliban is going to shoot if the U.S. shoots. They both basically mean the same thing, but CNN Headline News chose to use two different words. Revenge and retaliate. Why? What's attached to those words?
It makes the U.S. look stronger.
Okay, it makes the U.S. look stronger. Why?
Because retaliate used in the military.
Okay, because retaliate is used in the military. What's revenge used in? What do you think of when you think of revenge? Rebecca?
Unstable thinking.
Okay, unstable thinking. Revenge generally seems to be irrational, where retaliation is something that's thought of as being very logical or rational, planned, right? Revenge is kind of very emotional. I hear revenge and I think of people who have been cheated on by lovers or, you know, a high school girlfriend taking revenge against her boyfriend kind of thing, where retaliation, again, you think of the military. The fact that the action in itself was turned into a noun instead of a verb for the Taliban takes power away from it to begin with. And again, as a rhetorician, I'm breaking this sentence down to figure out what message CNN is trying to send me. And this is in the 6 seconds that it's scrolling under the screen kind of thing. The way that you send messages, the choices that you make a difference in terms of what meaning is conveyed. Now I want to work through this example quickly, one that my students haven't seen, to do the kind of the same work. And this shows, that was 9/11 specifically. This is the aftermath of 9/11. These headlines are all talking about the same event. I'm going to go through a series of them. All right? These headlines are all talking about the same event. I want to see what kind of meaning is conveyed through the choices that these writers made. Caught spying, FBI asks student to return GPS tracker. What do you understand from that sentence? What's going on? What's this story going to be about? What would you expect to read if you saw this as a headline?
I think you would expect that the student was caught spying.
Okay, that's one of the questions. All right, who are the actors? Again, you know, you want to look at the FBI and the student are in this. Who is spying? Who do you think is spying from this headline? You think the FBI is spying. You think the students, this isn't really clear, right? From this headline, you don't really know what was going on. Somebody was spying. There's a student, there's the FBI, and there's a GPS tracker, okay? Not really clear what's going on. Same story, same incident, different headline. Caught spying on student, FBI demands GPS tracker back, okay? If we look at the differences between these two, caught spying on student, now we know who's doing the spying. Okay, FBI demands GPS tracker back. So the FBI was spying on this student and wants its GPS tracker back. Look at the difference between asks and demands. What kind of effect does that have on your understanding of the situation? Okay? The use of the word spying is going to come into play too. This is another headline, same story, different news source. FBI tracks California student with outdated spy gear. If you look at the changes, it changes the way that you understand the situation. FBI tracks as opposed to the FBI spying. What's the difference in your understanding with those two changes? If you're tracking somebody, it doesn't sound as serious, it doesn't sound as sinister as if you're spying on someone. Tracks California student with outdated spy gear. When you hear California student, who do you see? What does a California student look like to you? Okay, California student, how many of you see a surfer? Okay, what's that student generally like, personality-wise? Easygoing. Okay, FBI is tracking this kind of surfer student with outdated spy gear. That's the message that this headline sends without saying that directly, okay? That's the image that we get in our head. Again, same incident, same story, different headline. Muslim student finds FBI's device on his car. Now who do you see? Do you see the surfer? Who do you see? Becca?
Well, Muslim, but in post 9/11, terrorists.
Okay. FBI tracks California student with outdated spy gear. That headline makes it seem like the FBI are a bunch of idiots and fools. Outdated spy gear, first of all, okay, makes fun of the FBI. And that they're tracking this surfer dude makes them seem like they're wasting their time. This headline, Muslim student finds FBI's GPS device on his car. The FBI isn't doing anything in this sentence, in this headline. Right? They have no action. They're taking no part in what's going on. All right? The Muslim student finds. The Muslim student is the one who's acting, which makes it seem like the Muslim student is the aggressor. And the fact that the student is now Muslim and not California makes it seem more like a threat. Same story, different headline. Report, Arab American student finds FBI tracking device on his car. Now that you know that it's Arab American, Muslim, or California, how does the meaning change for you, or your understanding of the situation, of the story, of the information that's being given to you by these news sources? The difference in the verbs, tracks, finds, spies, they all make a difference in the way that we make meaning out of what's going on in our world post 9/11. And this is the kind of work that rhetoricians do all day long. Some of us do it on a very detailed level to the point where this becomes our research. Some of us do it as activists, where we have blogs or we take part in organizations that actually make these kinds of readings known to the public so that people can actively participate in the meaning making of the history of 9/11. So what I was hoping that this little introduction to rhetoric was going to do was get you to understand how a message is sent affects what that message is. Okay, how you get your information, the language, and a whole bunch of other factors is going to affect what you understand. That rhetoric studies how language constructs reality, basically, and that some of us in rhetoric have taken on the task of analyzing the discourse of 9/11 and the discourse of its aftermath to start to understand how our history is being written with the event. That's it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Teresa. Hopefully, I know we've had 4 great panelists tonight, heard some very interesting talks on PTSD, on philosophy education, rhetoric, and doing business after 9/11. I'd like to see if anyone has any questions for our panelists, perhaps. Rebecca?
I have a question. It's in rhetoric. Have you found that using 9/11 or saying September 11th is substantial?
It's meaning.
In terms of meaning, is that, I just think it's some people use 9/11.
Yes.
And some people use September 11th. And
Yes.
I'm just wondering.
I can tell you in the academic literature, regardless of field, most of the time it's written out as September 11th, September 1/1. I personally have been using 9/11 since 9/11. And I think that has a lot to do with my connection to New York, to the way that what my family called it, the day that it happened, the way that we refer to it all the time. And even in my teaching, and like I said, there's a lot of people in there are my students, in my courses I refer to it as 9/11. But in the literature itself, it's referred to as September 11th. And I think it does, it all makes a difference in the meaning.
Thank you.
Sister Foley?
I'd like to ask a question, not of the presenters, but of the audience. First presentation was on you. And I'm wondering whether you thought what Rebecca Haggerty said was accurate.
I think it's really accurate. Like, that's really true. Where you said like parents they don't just let you go anymore, because my parents they show for us everywhere. Like for my little sister to take her to swim practice, take her to her friend's house. All her information that she said today was really accurate, and it was really interesting to see coming from you that that's how we live and that's how we're growing up. It was really accurate.
Yeah, I feel like it's definitely an accurate thing. It's sort of weird group our group together like that. I know I call my mom for praise, and it just shows our relationship. And if I get 100 on a test, I want her to know. And you were talking about praise, and I'm one of those people who want to help people when I grow up. The whole meaning issue, I thought that was really interesting that it doesn't just relate to me.
I don't know if you have an idea, but does 9/11 have an independent impact upon the millennial generation compared to, Columbine and the other incidences?
I think so, just from everything that I've read, and then I've read quite a bit on the different generations, and I think that is the most, I think Columbine and the Amber Alerts and all of that contribute to this sense of things are out of control, but I think 9/11 was it was really out of control, and I think that put everybody on edge. You're kind of in that fight and flight, and when you were talking about that gentleman, when he heard that gunfire, or the backfire of the car, and he ran and hid under the car, I think all those instances that we have just kind of raise those feelings up again from 9/11. So,
I think
did that answer?
a big millennial response to, and maybe younger people in the audience could, render their opinion. I was surprised by the reaction on college campuses to killing Osama bin Laden. The celebrations, the getting up in the middle of the night, and a lot of it was explained as this was the boogeyman of our time, and we got him. And those feelings of safety that they never had, that you were alluding to. Did you guys feel that? What was your reactions to the assassination, or whatever you want to say, of Osama bin Laden? Did you celebrate? Okay, well, tell us what that was about.
Like you said, Osama bin Laden was the boogeyman, this undisclosed monster who we all kind of feared. So, it sounds terrible to celebrate someone's death, but I I think that there's not one person in here who felt a sense of relief and a sense of patriotism when that happened. I mean, I know I wore a t-shirt with the American flag the next day. I know actually on this campus, I wasn't here, freshman, but a rally did happen. So I think that's an accurate statement. And absolutely.
One of the things that I've been studying, I'm actually in the process of doing work on the response to the death of Osama bin Laden. And I call it the death of Osama bin Laden. Remember, I'm in rhetoric, we worry about language. I haven't found language yet that I'm comfortable with to define what happened. You know, is it the killing of Osama bin Laden? Is it the death of Osama bin Laden? Is it the assassination of Osama bin Laden? I can't find a term that I'm comfortable with yet, so I just refer to it as the death. And our response as a culture, not so much as individuals, because individual people have different responses, but what was visible, that celebration that was visible, I've been tracing how the language that we've used to talk about 9/11, and in particular Osama bin Laden, kind of led up to that kind of reaction. And one of the terms that I was going to use as an example in tonight's presentation was the characterization of the terrorists who perpetrated 9/11 as the enemies of freedom. And that was an almost immediate characterization. I had done a sampling of 18 speeches over George Bush's first 4 years in office to see how he referred to terrorists. And enemies of freedom was second in those 18 speeches, only 2 terrorists. And to think about growing up and listening to enemies of freedom, enemies of freedom, enemies of freedom all over and over again, it creates a constant enemy. So the idea that the boogeyman, you know, that our enemy was gone, you know, was the reaction was celebratory in that sense. But we, as generations, I'm looking at the language and how that led up to it. I can tell you I did not celebrate, and I didn't feel relief at all. And as an educator, as, you know, as a person on this earth, as somebody, you know, how do I want to live my life kind of thing, I was devastated by the reaction. I was very, very upset by it.
Well, I agree with what you're saying. I had kind of a numb response to the whole thing. I suppose I was glad, but gladness would not be a feeling I was having. It was just, there's a chapter closed, I suppose. Right. And I like what you were saying about when I was trying to find the word, I didn't know what word I wanted to use to describe what we had done. I spoke a lot about rhetoric. But
from my perspective,
people killed in 9/11, 342 firefighters.
343, yeah.
Was the order of Obama or bin Laden to attack 9/11, wasn't it?
That's the way that we understand it, yeah. That bin Laden was the mastermind of 9/11.
Well, we don't want to tell anybody or wish they were dead, but
I think there's, as you guys are speaking now, I feel like there's a difference in the reaction between our generation and your generation now. I think the line is more clear because, I mean, now that I think about it, I think, you know, those people who did celebrate or show, you know, how they felt that day were mostly young Americans.
I think it had a lot to do with the time of day, too, to tell you the truth. The news was broken at like 10 o'clock at night. Mostly old people were asleep or in bed. So what we got to see was a lot of young people celebrating. But I can tell you, my family members of all ages, I had a lot of family members who celebrated in the way, maybe they didn't go out into the streets, but Facebook the next day was full of messages, celebratory messages in response to it. So while we got to see a lot of young people, again, out in the streets, holding rallies, celebrating, I don't think the celebration was just limited to young people. I saw it across the generations.
Rachel.
Why would we celebrate this? Or is it real? Like, what does that say about us? So I think, I don't know, I think there's a lot of like private discussions about like the reaction to things.
You want to call the students? There's a way over in that
Oh,
person.
sorry.
I think we're not establishing a clear line of patriotism versus celebration, because I know one thing, it's not like something personal that you like, even adults growing up, like at a bar, you're together to celebrate with, but rather it's something like as a sense of pride that like no matter what happens to America, with the death of, like I said, 4,000 people, that we will eventually come to a clean, like take care or end the cause of what's going on with all this. Like you said, you don't wish death upon anybody, but when you look at what you did, you do feel a sense of like security that the cause of all this is done. But then again, there's a sense of uncertainty because their master or their leader is dead, so you don't know what that means. So again, it's like back to the younger generation versus the older generation, patriotism versus celebration.
I think for me, as a political scientist who studies international relations, the questions for me are always a little bit different. I think when I started off tonight's talk, it was a little bit, everything changed after 9/11. But really, for many of us, it's more, that was the beginning. 9/11 was the beginning when we were attacked, and then Osama bin Laden's death was the end. It was sort of this, it's not a chapter in an ongoing book, but it was sort of the beginning of the story and the end of the story.
There's a nice clean decade too, a good 10 years.
There's a 10-year, it's a decade, but the United States had been involved in several conflicts with Al-Qaeda itself for at least a decade, around a decade pre-9/11. We had a history of difficult relations with Muslim extremists or more fundamentalists in the Middle East going back several decades. And it was more than just about they hate us for our freedom. Different questions internal to the Middle East and to the Islamic community, mostly in the Middle East, about the role of the United States, our support for Egypt, our support for Saudi Arabian government, support for Israel, a lot of things that led up to 9/11, which gets back to when Professor Grettano started talking about retaliation, right? It's contested in some ways who started it. From our perspective, a lot about 9/11, they attacked us on 9/11, and the month later, we retaliated in Afghanistan. Whereas that isn't entirely the perspective of Al-Qaeda. And that was an attack to get even for decades of U.S. support for repressive governments in the Middle East. Not just repressive governments, but U.S. occupation, having thousands of troops based in Saudi Arabia, right? And so this idea, when we're talking about who attacked first or who's the victim and who's the aggressor, that's all about rhetoric, which was interesting as well to think about. And I don't think we've had a very good discussion about it as a culture in our country. The other thing for us as a political scientist, what does it mean that Osama bin Laden has died for his movement, right, or those who share his ideals? And that there's a lot of questions for us about how important leadership actually is to movements. And so when you decapitate the leadership of any type of social movement, violent or nonviolent, you start to think about what are the implications for their survival of that institution. Do they adapt? And so again, from political science, we approach it very differently. I think we can approach it from more of a philosophical perspective in political science, a more empirical perspective, a clash of civilizations and culture perspective too. Yes, I know we weren't represented during the talk, but I want to throw my 2 cents in there. Anybody else? Any last comments, questions? Again, I'd like to thank everyone for coming tonight, participating, especially the panelists who gave up some time on a Wednesday night or Thursday night, right? Thursday night, right? And we will have another presentation for Education for Justice about a month from now. We're going to have Mark Volk come in and talk about his experience on 9/11 when he was serving at the Pentagon. So please be on the lookout for some advertisements about our next program. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night.